So hello once again, and Mick, I'm really, really happy that we are here with you and that you are here with us for a dialogue and conversation. I know that you're more than busy, so I really appreciate that you took the time.
Thank you. That's very kind. It's nice to be here.
Um, I think, and right now I think I've got 5 or 6 paths how I could start this conversation, and I quickly choose one. I think it's about 20 years ago when I personally began to connect your publications, your writings with a person, Mick Cooper. And I'm pretty sure it was 2008 in the World Conference in Beijing in China. It was not only the PC conference, but it was World Conference of Psychotherapy. And I heard people there saying, I have to check if I can find Mick Cooper because I'm interested in discussing some points with him. And I just thought, there could be a person that within the PC community could be embedded in a broader and wider thinking of psychotherapy, because being in Beijing is some kind of, at least, being interested in the Far East. And whether this meets you or not, but your name in my thoughts is connected with embedding and connecting in a broader way than just the PC world. That's one part. And I could immediately dive in and discuss some PC theory, but I'm not doing this right now. I take another way. Yesterday evening I was preparing for our conversation, and in the middle I just received an email from our training institute, and it was an invitation for workshop for diversity. And at the end of this invitation there was a link with the topic inspiration, and I clicked the link and bam bam, there it was. What I found was your social justice and the PCE approach celebrating in February the 6th, 2024. And I just loved this incident of life. I just was thinking how we could start a conversation, and then I got the invitation, and suddenly I'm on this homepage and on the network that you are within. And actually this is the path I am, and I think we are interested also to talk some special parts and items, the socio-political aspects of our approaches. But for the moment, I'm going to stop here and just invite Thomas to also say a few sentences.
Thank you. Thank you, hello, Mick. Thank you. I'm Thomas. I'm a psychologist, and I'm in training as a person-centered therapist. And you have been a companion in my studies. And now you are here in a Zoom meeting, and I can talk to you. That's fine. And I really got so into my preparation. I read your book because I'm an activist too, and in NGOs, and I tried to make my best to make the world a little bit better. And you put down in words so many thoughts, and it was really inspiring to read this book. So I have a lot of questions, but it's not an interview we are going to talk to. It's a kind of dialogue, and I'm open to that, where it will lead us. Fine.
Yeah, and then it's the thing that connects me to you, Mick, is that I was always looking for people who develop their own person-centered style, because that's what Rogers told us to do, right? Find your own therapeutic way, and yeah. And I think you do, and you share it with other people. That's special, and also a lot of people can connect to what you do and how you talk about it. And then I read the things, but then I also saw you talk about more about personal things, and that was what inspired me most, probably. That you that you can kind of you are a person-centered human in all the roles and aspects. You read about politics and institutions, but also about what could person-centered parenting be, and then so the personal aspect, and what do you need in order to be such an open-minded, person-centered human in all these roles? That's the thing that, yeah, is most interesting to me. And if you can, of course, choose what's the thing you want to start with, but that would be my insight, kind of.
Yeah, such a great question. It's you. I mean, just to start, I guess talk about person-centered and politics maybe, and then, you know, it's great the idea of having a dialogue. I mean, I think for me, the person-centered approach is deeply political, and we obviously see that in the way that Rogers developed over time and became more involved in peace. But I think just from the very start, the idea that the client has wisdom and knowledge and a contribution to make is a deeply political position, really. It's a way, I mean, it's not just a kind of clinical philosophy, it's also a way of thinking about people and questioning the hierarchies. I've been thinking a lot recently, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot recently is about the idea of what humanism is. And I think the core of humanism is the belief that every human being is of intrinsic equal worth. And, you know, tracing that back to Rousseau and kind of humanistic ideas over time, it's such a fundamental challenge to more authoritarian or more hierarchical or more kind of beliefs that prioritize certain lives. I was in Madrid actually just at the weekend and visiting the palace, and just the opulence and the inequality, you know, when you know about the kind of poverty a lot of people were living in, and then the richness that some people had. And I guess that basic belief, when I was there with my partner, we were thinking, just trying to understand phenomenologically, like, how did people live with that? And I guess there was that belief in superiority of some lives. But I think humanism is the belief in the intrinsic equal value of all lives. And I think that comes through in Rogers's work right from the beginning, and even more so in, I guess, in his later work around peace and the peace projects, and trying to bring people together from an understanding that there isn't one right group and one wrong group, but that phenomenologically, I think and I was also thinking actually recently that still can't say it, phenomenology itself is deeply political, in the sense that when we start with people's experiencing in the world, there isn't a hierarchy to it. There isn't some experiencing is of more value than other. All human experiencing is of equal value, and therefore that introduces a kind of equality. I guess for me, where the complexities start to come in relation to the person-centered approach is around power. And I'm not convinced that as a field we've completely got that right yet. I think there's, I think where, say, multicultural perspectives and more maybe kind of socialist political perspective, radical perspectives, how think other differently. The difference between that and maybe a more kind of liberal regime perspective is around power. And Rogers, I mean, I guess people would accuse him of being naive, but there's a kind of a priori assumption which goes with liberalism that people start from fairly equal places. And we know that's not true in therapy. We know in therapy that clients often feel that they put the therapist on the pedestal, or the therapist has power, there's deference. So I think there is an unequal playing field. And likewise in society, I think we do start from a very unequal playing field. And therefore, kind of recognizing that and thinking about how we approach that, whether that's in terms of gender, race, first world, global north, global south. I think we need to think about where power sits and how we conceptualize that because again, phenomenology maybe doesn't quite, particularly when it's a more individualistic phenomenology, or the notion of the actualizing tendency, don't easily conceptualize power. I guess you could talk about conditions of worth, and you could talk about women having conditions of worth and for different marginalized groups, but it's still quite individualistic. So those are some initial thoughts, and how we tie that. I think person-centered, I mean, just to add maybe, I think person-centered has something really fundamental to contribute, but the book that I wrote, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, is really a book for progressives, saying and arguing that therapy, person-centered therapy, the kind of deep work that we do, concepts of empathy have a real important contribution to make to social change in terms of a more humanized approach, in terms of ensuring that we don't get into a more authoritarian politics, or a politics which becomes more blaming and demonizing and black and white. I've been following some of the kind of channels in the UK about, like, we have a party called Your Party, which is very left, but a lot of the language is so hate-filled and just, you know, even anti-Semitic at times. I mean that's a whole other area. And I think that says something about how the left progressive needs some that we bring some self-reflection, empathy, acceptance, which I think is really important. Sorry, that's a lot there. So much to talk about.
Mm. You mentioned two aspects that I was thinking of for, I think, the last years, and it's about the question, and now I'm at the therapeutic world, and then taking the bridge to the socio-political aspect. If I have to describe the PCE approach, I think I would mention the dimension, the special way of being with all the items, with all the topics we can discuss, but I'm not going to discuss this now. And that's and the way of power. And I think power, and it's a huge and really complex dimension. And this could be an aspect where I can easily describe a difference between the PCE world and other psychotherapeutic dimensions or ways to treat people. And in this article or interview of this social justice, he also mentioned that the person-centered approach, and I actually think I didn't read this in this stringent way. Of course, it's about individualism, as about the individuum. But I always understood it embedded and connected with everything. So there's nothing that's not connected, there's nothing that's not in interdependence with people or with environment or whatever. And I think, or I thought that this individual aspect and my understanding of the PCE, there's a difference, and I think there's a gap, and maybe that's male bias in history, I don't know, about understanding social being or human being completely isolated. And you said and that's the bridge to the socio-political aspect. You described, that's what you said before, the phenomenological level, that it could be really helpful, and now I have to look up, to create something that could be so special and so powerful and so badly needed in the world today. So that's a really strong description, really strong words. And you connected it with embedded phenomenological. And I'm not sure if I get the point what I wanted to say, but the way of being with inherently has the aspect of being connected within myself and with other people, with my surroundings, with my environment, with everything. And is this something that you say we could be more, that there could be more difference in explaining that, or this is a dimension that's we need to theorize?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point. And I think that, I mean, if we just take the one about the environment, you can understand person-centeredness. And of course, Peter Schmidt, who we really sadly lost, wrote a lot about kind of being in connection. But if we take something like the environment, I think you could understand that to be person-centered is to have a connection with the environment, is to have a care for the environment, it is intrinsically to be on the side of a kind of green political perspective that takes environmental issues and climate change very, very seriously. I think that's certainly what I would love to think that the person-centered approach was. And I think as you describe it, because the approach is about connection and connection at multiple levels, it really opens up that possibility. At the same time, I think if you look in the literature on from person-centered authors, even if I think in our own handbook of person-centered therapy, there really wasn't anything about environmental issues. So I think we have to recognize it is missing. And I think it also, I think there's multiple ways that people understand what it means to be person-centered. And I think sometimes in our approach, we don't have enough discussion about what we actually mean by it, and people use it and they have lots and lots of different understandings. I'm pretty confident there are people who, for them, person-centered really has nothing to do with the environment, and they just wouldn't understand it in the way you're describing, Michaela. And that's a different view of it. But I think maybe we need to have a way of thinking about a dialogue and articulating those different understandings, really, because otherwise it just becomes too much of a kind of mishmash of different understandings that aren't articulated and implicit, and we all have our kind of intuitive understanding of what it means, but we don't actually talk about what it is. Does being person-centered mean supporting green politics around the environment? I think it does, but I don't think everybody would agree with that. There's some people maybe in the wider, certainly therapeutic field, who would see person-centered in a very individualistic, more kind of libertarian sense. Sometimes you see that in the person-centered, more kind of libertarian, right-wing. Recently having a discussion with somebody who, from a person-centered perspective, was saying that there shouldn't be any public provision of mental health services. It should all be in the private sector. And I'm sure they would see that as being rooted in Rogers as well. And I would guess wouldn't particularly see the environment as a issue. So I think we need those discussions.
I'm really resonating with the thing you and Michaela says. Neville, for example, said that we are all in an interconnection, and he stressed out formative tendency from Rogers. And I think sometimes our approach is, and I want to ask you about your intention that you build up a space or made a space. It's called Therapy and Social Change Network, because I think sometimes it's not only that in our therapies we have to make a space and open the space that somebody is developing, also in, I would say, civil society, or in a kind of open up and encountering and open up the space that people can gather, that they can feel the power and the energy. And so I want to ask you, what was your intention to make this, and how does it work, or what's that exactly?
I mean, I love that terminology, opening up a space. And I think we can come back to that, because like the work that I've done around pluralism, which again I would see as deeply person-centered, is I think very much rooted in that philosophy of opening up a space. What does it mean to open up a space? But I think, as you say, Thomas, that as therapists, as person-centered therapists, that's what we do, is we open up a space. And we could have a discussion about what that means on a social, political level. I think there's a big, important question about how active that is. Like, I would argue that sometimes behaving in a non-directive way sometimes isn't the most effective or helpful way of opening up a space. Like there's debates around things like broaching. Like this is a separate point, but broaching is where you would actively invite clients to talk about issues of difference. And for instance, in the American multicultural approaches, they're very keen on broaching on the grounds that clients often need to be invited into that space, that to hold a kind of neutral, non-directive stance, to wait for the client to bring those issues in. As you see in Rogers's famous video that they used to call Working with a Black Client, now working with, I think, sadness and guilt, sadness and anger. He doesn't actively create that space. He waits for the client to bring those issues in, and actually there's debates about whether he tends to shut it down. Anyway, that's one thing. But the therapy and social change network that we created was very much about trying to create a space where we can have dialogues around the links between the personal and the political, and it's open to therapists from whatever orientation. And I guess that was partly because, going back to what we were talking about, Michaela, I'd love to see the person-centered approach as intrinsically political, but because there is so much difference around there, and also I guess because I see part of the person-centered ethos about being inclusive, it felt easier and more straightforward just to create space. Anybody who's interested in therapy doesn't have to be a therapist, but is exploring the links between the kind of wider structural political issues and then the kind of innermost psychological issues. We actually started after we had a conference after the Ukrainian invasion, and to raise money for Psychologists Ukraine with John Wilson at Online Events, and we held a big conference, raised some money, and then went on to think it'd be really nice to have a network. Initially with a lot of person-centered people, like Maria Consari was involved, and we've had some people from the person-centered community come in or be involved, and it's very tight links. And we've had over, I think, about 30, 40 seminars now, people exploring these issues. We've done podcasts. I think it's a very loose network. It's dependent on volunteers. So sometimes we have more energy than others. It'd be lovely to have people involved in it. And we're still kind of working out quite what we're doing. But I think just what we know is that we want to concentrate on that space between that deep psychological relational processes and then the wider political areas, both in terms of what politics and progressive politics can contribute towards our therapeutic practice, and how we can make our practice and our training and our work and our services more politically aware and sensitive, and addressing issues like marginalisation. Like a big issue we have in the UK, for instance, is often an absence of Black trainees on programs, coming into programs, and also then often them feeling quite silenced about talking about what it means to be Black, and feeling that they can't talk about it, or feeling that they're kind of told, even sometimes by trainers, that these aren't issues to be discussed. So that's a kind of concern. And then the other side of it is thinking about how we can contribute, what our ideas, what our work as therapists and psychotherapists can contribute to these wider political structures. And there's groups like in the UK we have a group called Compassion in Politics, which was related to compassion focused therapy developed by Paul Gilbert, which has a lot of person-centered elements. And they've done amazing work kind of talking to politicians and linking up with people in our parliament, thinking about where compassion sits in terms of, and not just in terms of their politics, but also in terms of their relationships with others. And we've had them talk about the ways that, the politicians, that it's a really toxic environment, that there's a lot of, it's very difficult to talk about vulnerabilities as a politician, that it's not easy to be congruent or authentic in your life. So really important discussions, I think, about, what would it mean for politicians to be able to be authentic, genuinely open, vulnerable, not knowing, like often the worst thing a politician can say is that they don't know something, whereas we know a lot of the time we don't know. And when we work with our clients or from ourselves, saying actually I don't know, or I'm scared, is really important. So we're trying to open up that space.
I want to go 3 steps behind, and you wrote something about that we can easily caught up in lower level goals, and I'm not quite sure if I can get the point I would like to express, but actually I'm really surprised that still the discussion of directivity or non-directivity is such a big theme. Because from my understanding, and in Austria we really have a good psychotherapist education in the PCE world. It lasts about 4 to 6 years studying PCE and about 2 years studying the theory of PCE, and then starting to practice with clients. And I think it really makes sense that we take such a long time to really understand and to really experience what I think Dave Mertens wants to first with this relational death. And I think at a special death of relation, so this relational being, the question of directivity no longer occurs. And I think of this discussion of directivity, for me personally, is something of lower level goals. Because when I really understand the person-centered approach, the question of directivity, I can use it for distinction to other therapy dimensions. But when I really get the attitude and the way of being with, the question for me no longer occurs. And I think, I don't know, how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way that you put that. And I would absolutely, again, agree with you. I think for me, person-centered practice is about establishing, developing a connection which allows the client to be fully who they are. And in that relationship, I think there's a fluid dynamic where there are some elements of bringing ourselves in, obviously, and inevitably there's going to be some directivity and non-directivity there. And I agree with you that I'm not sure that framework is particularly useful. But I think in terms of training and practice, I think that, I mean, a lot of people in the UK still understand person-centered approach as about being non-directive. And there's good evidence that comes through. For instance, so we did a study where we did a big study of school-based humanistic counselling, which was very much rooted in person-centered approach, and how young people experienced it. And we interviewed about 50 young people, and about a third of them said that they wanted more input from the therapist.
Yes.
And about a third of them said that they were uncomfortable with the silences. I mean, they really liked it, and there was, there was lots of things they liked. They liked being able to get things off their chest. They liked developing insight. Interestingly, they also talked a lot about they really liked the advice from the therapist and the guidance. That's how the young people framed what they were getting. So I think that, but there was this area of things that they were either, not that they all really strongly dislike that, but it ranged from people just kind of noticing that they felt a bit awkward in these silences down to dropping out because they just felt the therapy was too passive to them. So I think, something is happening, and I think there's something that, that needs addressing and that needs thinking about in terms of what it means to be person-centered. Because
I'm sorry to interrupt. And for me, there would be a bridge to think the context we are working with, and that's what we just see within the tribes of the person-centered world. When I do encountering or facilitation in Argentina, I would need more storytelling. When I go to anywhere else, I would more dancing, laughing, but that's not directive at all. For me, that's a response or a resonance on a really relational depth. So that connects to the environment and the embellishment thing is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important, but I think we kind of need, I mean, that's, I guess, where research comes in, is to understand that, to kind of explore that, to recognize that, to understand what it means and what might be most suited to, for instance, particular cultures or particular areas of work. I guess the thing about relational depth is, and obviously I've written about that as well. And I do think that deep connection is really, really important and is foundational for therapy. But I think as an approach, we also need to kind of I think that, you know, so I think what some therapists would interpret that as meaning is that I just go with my intuitive gut feel, and that my intuitive gut about how I feel about things is, you know, the kind of the only and the essential guide to practice. And I think that, you know, thinking about issues like directivity, non-direct, thinking about issues like culture, thinking about you drawing on the research also helps to inform a perspective that can bring in other views as well. Because I think we need that to be able to kind of tailor and adjust to the particular clients that we work with. And I would again see that as political. You know, I think politically, listening to ourselves is a really important political element, but also dialogue means about listening to the other. And some, you know, Buber writes about this. It's like, or I'm sorry, Levinas, like how do we move beyond the solipsism, which is just about our experiencing or our experiencing of the other person's experiencing? How do we open out, you know, going back to Thomas's term, how do we open out a space to genuine otherness? And I think that doesn't just come through relational depth. I think it partly does.
Yes, yes,
But
yeah, I agree with that.
But I think there's a risk that relational depth, you know, the distinction between relational depth and solipsism, I guess that experiencing is an interesting one. And I think sometimes, you know, we can have that really intuitively. I mean, if you look at the evidence, you know, we can intuitively feel that something is deeply correct and actually be completely wrong. And particularly when we're talking about the other's experiencing, our intuitive feel of the other's experiencing sometimes can be deeply, deeply wrong. And so there is that need to kind of be open to something other outside.
Yes. And also being in dialogue with clients or with anyone, not thinking about the structural power is inherent in every experience we take. And I think this has nothing to do with directionality or non-directivity, but I think it's a failure not to mention or not to think about structural power in dialogues, in psychotherapy or wherever. And this is a bridge to the field of the social political aspects.
Yeah. But Michaela, sorry to interrupt, but let's take an example. So me as a white man, say I'm in an encounter with a black woman, or I'm working with a black woman.
Yeah.
So as a white man, I might feel very vulnerable. And my personal experience might be of kind of my anxiety and my vulnerability and maybe shame and fear. And I think what you're saying is that, you know, that might be my kind of like deep intuitive feeling, and the structural power that as a white man I have over a black woman and the inequalities, there's a difference there that might not just isn't necessarily wholly graspable within my phenomenological field. That I think what you're saying is that I need to understand something more.
And we need some awareness of that,
Yeah, absolutely. We need that. And I don't think that just comes from the inside. And I guess that's where I think a kind of more relational understanding of what it means to be person-centered, rather than one which is purely about the kind of inner actualizing tendency.
Yeah.
So we all share being human, but we don't know what being human is for the other person. So that's why we always have to watch out for any sign that could help us understand what it's like.
I think so, absolutely, Daniela. And I think that goes back to your question, you know, you were saying about what do we need to do at the beginning. And I think there's something about that kind of self-criticality, not in a kind of negative and condemning way, but something about that willingness to kind of challenge and to be open to something, you know, like Levinas talks a lot about this kind of concept of otherness, like the stranger, the widow, the orphan. And it's something about, you know, and that's where he goes beyond Buber. And again, thinking about Pacey Schmidt, who used a lot of Levinas, it's like that willingness to be struck by something outside of our experiencing. Like, I think that's and I think that's often emotionally really challenging, because we have our kind of schema, we have our understandings, we have our armor, as Buber talks about, and then how do we allow something to kind of pierce that armor and and recognize something other. And I think some of the developments around that, I mean, like Donna Haraway, I don't know if you've read Donna Haraway talking about the natural world and like the kind of the openness to the environment, and how do we take into account the kind of being of beings that are non-human. That goes beyond the kind of internal experiencing to kind of think about the weird and the bizarre and the strange. There's kind of elements of leverness to that when we think about the environment. It's not just all contained within our experiencing. Sorry, Daniela.
No, I really I like the way your thoughts were going, because I can try to follow them. And that's I think what what made most impression to me, as I said, was that you seem to be a person who also developed their own style, but also, like Roger said, he got more and more open to his own resonances, and he got more authentic by it took a lot of time. And also the now I had the feeling that I could feel you, I could follow you to where you went. So I like that you went somewhere and I could follow. Otherwise, I cannot expand my own knowledge. And it was just an example of what we talked about, that we have to follow the others to find new spaces. And then there is a space that opens up, and we can do that together. It's not only we who open up a space as therapists, but we have to follow. And I like that I could follow you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for me, I mean, when you say that, it makes me think about, for me, there is something about, you know, those concepts of otherness and difference. I do find them very energizing, and I guess that's a personal thing as well. You know, if I think about it in my life, like, you know, as a travel, you know, I mean, before I was a therapist, I really wanted to be a traveler. You know, I thought I was going to be a traveler. I never thought I'd be an academic or a clinician. I thought I was going to be a traveler. And I think for me, that idea and that excitement around meeting and encountering something very different resonates deeply for me in my life as well. You know, I love that idea of, you know, when I travel. I mean, I'm a terrible traveler because I'm completely manic. Like, I go somewhere and I just have to find my bearings, and I kind of go round, and my partner drives her crazy because, you know, we get somewhere and she wants to settle down in the hotel, and I'm like, I gotta go off here, I gotta go and find
A manic traveler.
and I think that's and I think there's cultural roots to that as well. I mean, being Jewish, there's the kind of, there's a itinerancy, a kind of being a bit lost in places and finding your bearings, and then kind of creating your home. So there's pretty cultural dimensions. And you're right, you know, we need to find I mean, Daniela, for you, what is interesting, you were saying, do you have a sense of you finding your way, that what resonates for you?
I think I do more and more when I'm more like rooted in myself, phases in my life when I can when it's easier to follow others, then being a therapist and being in these relationships, it's like enriching. It's taking me to other places in myself, because other people show me ways in themselves, and then I can explore more. And I think it has, like my map, the map inside of me has to be growing because of this. And that's what I kind of, there's a picture in my head that I had right now when you talk, that the map is getting bigger. Sometimes it's maniac traveling, and sometimes it's another person who takes you by the hand and says, hey, come on, there's a spot you haven't seen. It's calm there. So I have to be both for other people, and I have to let others get that close to me so I can also follow them in this. Yeah. So I think it's happening, but it takes time too.
Yeah, I think there's that. I guess partly what draws us all to person-centered therapy probably is that the awe and wonder of being alongside somebody in their experiencing. That is a really magical place to be in. I mean, that's what I love about the person-centered approach, that we don't kind of focus on diagnosis or blocking someone in or defining someone in a particular way, but that being alongside is such a deeply rewarding experience.
And that's on the individual level, but I also thought that us talking to you or us talking to other people is our social justice group, because it's like I know that I can connect these spaces within myself and others, individuals, but also I think I have not found like specific ways for myself to be that curious, the curiosity or the awe that you talked about, that I can have with individuals or groups that I'm present with. I cannot have these with institutions or, as you said, like political groups or anything like that. But I would need that. I would need the person-centered world and the therapeutic world, and also just more interconnectedness to other fields like social studies or political studies, so I could feel the connection there too.
Yeah,
I would
and I
need
think
that.
yeah, and I think that can be really positive. I've just done a book with edited a book with Bill Miller from Motivational Interviewing, where we look at person-centered approaches in areas like education and nursing, and as well as psychotherapy. Policing is an interesting one, person-centered policing. And thinking about the implications that are trying to bring together kind of person-centered principles from across these different fields. But I just wanted to go back to one thing you also saying, because I think that openness to otherness that we experience as therapists is also then, when we think about, I mean, certainly in the UK, there's lots of issues about refugees, asylum seekers, people coming over, fears about them taking over, and fears about difference. And so, but for me, I think a person-centered approach, that curiosity about difference, that seeing the foreigner, I mean, Levinas talks about this, seeing the foreigner not in terms of a threat, but in terms of a contribution, in terms of what they bring, the wonder and the awe of different cultures. And I guess people do, I mean, I understand people have a need to feel safe, and that difference is often threatening. And, I can experience that as well, in terms of things that are unusual. But I think also that idea of a kind of approach, attitude towards life, and a stance that welcomes otherness is something. I think the stance that welcomes otherness is something politically is so badly needed. And I guess maybe that is something I think a person-centered approach is fundamentally rooted in, is that welcoming of otherness. And there's obviously always going to be a balance between kind of an openness to otherness, a welcoming of otherness, and need for security and safety, and that we, throughout our lives we kind of move through that. But I think that where the dominant politic becomes one of fearing the other, then politically we run into problems. You see that not just in attitudes towards asylum seekers and refugees, but in wars and conflicts. So much of that is driven by a kind of fear of otherness, which I think just doesn't have to. I think most fundamentally, it doesn't have to be there. Like, that can change, and I feel quite optimistic about that change. I feel optimistic that kind of a way of approaching the world that is more approach based rather than avoidance based is possible, and the evidence supports that. So I think whether we're thinking about person-centered therapy and that kind of welcoming of otherness and that willingness to be with otherness, or at a wider political level, there's that value in that openness to otherness, the value of diversity, multiculturalism, appreciating difference. And I think as a person-centered community, we bring that. we have that as our philosophy that we can bring into those wider spaces, not just in our client work, but also in the wider political spaces. And maybe there's something about, just thinking about this, that if we go in as we do with a stance of empathy and understanding, that allows difference to be exciting rather than frightening. It's like that difference is frightening if we just see it as an entity, if we kind of see it as an I stance. But if we go in with a stance of empathy, it becomes an understanding and acceptance. It becomes something which is more accessible, more something we can more kind of assimilate and not assimilate, but be aligned to. So I think there's lots of exciting possibilities we bring to politics.
Mm.
And I think that what you said, that really touched me. Empathy, if I can meet somebody accepting his otherness, encountering the other as a gift, then I think I'm empowered. And on the other hand, I feel that my way of being with this person then empowers them. And that's for me, not just in therapy so important, that's also in networks, that's also in all this political stuff so important. It touched me so much because I had sometimes met some politicians and I saw how they were masked and how long it took them to show them up as a person. And when they showed up, they were so empowered and they were so open. And that's the thing that was so important for me, that I got by talking and listening to you, that it empowers, if it's possible, to get to see the other as a gift and then connect.
I mean, it's a synergy, it's a win-win. And I think that one of the things I argued in my book is that, in the Psychology of Social Change, is that there's a kind of the argument for empathy and understanding is that it creates something better than a stance of fear and avoidance. It allows us to get more of our needs met more of the time as a culture, as a society, without really losing anything. That, you know, as you say, you feel empowered, the other person feels empowered. Like, kind of, why wouldn't you do that? And I think there is a natural movement towards synergy. I mean, I would understand the formative tendency as a kind of movement over time towards synergy. And I guess it would be nice to speed that up a bit by recognizing that win-win solutions add something that, you know, we don't need to have lose-lose solutions, because kind of fearing the other does create lose-lose solutions where we fear the other, they fear us, conflict, tension, war. Everybody loses. Person centered brings the idea that we can achieve something better for all of us through these ways of being empathic, being understanding. Yeah, it's brilliant. It's, you know, it's fantastic. We just need to let people know.
Yeah.
and listen, you know, not just kind of, you know, we got all the answers, but I think we got some really interesting answers.
That's so encouraging how you put that. Thank you.
And thank you so much that you described the ladder down. Fear feeds to fear, and the other way is a kind of openness feeds to, or it goes to openness. So it's a way up, and that's a kind of actualizing tendency or a formative tendency, and this is so fine foundation. Thank you very much.
You know, if you look at the literature on peace building, or you look at the literature on couples therapy, or you look at it, you know, it's all about finding these kind of more synergetic solutions. It does, you know, peace building is dependent on trust. You need to find ways of creating trust and overcoming that kind of deep-rooted fear of otherness. And it happens, it can work, but it's hard work.
Yeah.
I just have the timeline on mind. And when I just look at our conversation, I really feel like a manic traveler. And the main reason for that is that my language is, my mother language is not English, obviously. And this is such a limitation, and this drives me crazy. And I think this is a symbolic level of how I feel when I leave the therapeutic field going to the socio-political field of PCA. I lose my language. I have to speed down when my thoughts and my whole organism tendency is going to speed up. And then I get struggled. And that's what happened in this conversation as well. And that was one of the reasons why we asked you or invited you for this talk, because in this struggling, I need that the community or that voices out of our community really calm me down, find my language, and thank you for that, actually.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think, we've really been trying to find our way. I mean, we have no idea about how politics works.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to connect. But we've, through connections and through talking to people and through meeting people and beginning to meet politicians. I mean, Thomas was talking about meeting politicians as well. We're beginning to find a bit of an orientation, and to understand like how things work. And a lot of it is trial and error. I think a lot of it is just, but I think there's something about putting ourselves out there. I think one of the things I've always felt about the person-centered world is that I think because a lot of our focus is on congruence, we're often very connected with our fear and our vulnerability. And that's great and that's so important. But I think sometimes that means that we maybe don't take the risk of like pushing ourselves a bit more and actually going into spaces that do feel vulnerable and do feel scary and do feel where we're kind of disoriented and we don't know. But I think some of that is and can be important, not just for ourselves, but for also, the reality is we are at a time of polycrisis. We've got wars, we've got horrible risk of climate catastrophe, poverty, increasing inequalities. I kind of feel that we all have some responsibility to do something and to take those steps forward. And I think part of that is trying to find a courage to enter into spaces that we don't know necessarily. And it's really scary. It is really scary, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
The spaces we push each other and ourselves to could be spaces of comfort too, because we have all these crises in common. So that's just a light that we could follow.
Yeah.
So the facts might still be friendly. The environmental structural power is not friendly at all. And I really appreciate that you took the time for the conversation.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking to you all.
And all the best to you, Mick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.